So exploration means you're looking for answers related to the questions that you've asked. The next step, which is your fourth step, is forming a hypothesis. So a long time ago, you probably learned that a hypothesis is an educated guess. Well, in college, we really don't call it a guess at all. We say that a hypothesis is a possible answer based on exploration. So after you've done your exploration, you begin now to say, okay, what did the literature say? What did other investigators think? What does the textbook say? And you form your own hypothesis. You form a possible answer. In forming a possible answer to your question, one of the things that you really are careful to do is that you do not state it anymore as a question. So you do not state your hypothesis as a question. What you do is find out, make it as a statement, make sure that it is something that you can carry out an experiment for. So in your notebook, you have something like, it must be testable. That means you don't just throw out an answer, you throw out a possible answer that you can test to see if it is correct. It must be logical, it must make sense, and it must be based on available information, okay? Now, science advances by rejection of hypotheses. That is one of the quotations that you have in your book. And I ask you, what does it mean? Every time you come up with a hypothesis, the next step is going to be testing the hypothesis. So when you come up with a hypothesis, which is a statement, so go back to the cat food example. Do cats prefer one type of cat food to another? I explore, so I do my exploration. And as I do my exploration, I find out that literature seems to say that cats do not prefer a type of food. And that becomes my hypothesis. So I say, my hypothesis is that cats do not have any preference for what they feed on. They simply feed on what is available. Okay? That's my hypothesis. The next step is testing my hypothesis. Okay? Now, supposing I test my hypothesis and I find out that it's not correct. I reject my original hypothesis. When I say science advances by rejection of hypothesis, what I'm saying is when I reject one hypothesis, guess what I do next? You're right. I form a new hypothesis. That's how we know all the things that we know in science. We advance because we came up with a hypothesis which we thought this is the answer. This is the reason why this is happening. We test that hypothesis and then we find out that that's really not correct. And so we reject that hypothesis and we propose a new one. So I'm excited because I want to share with you guys research that I had done in which I had a hypothesis and I tested my hypothesis and then I ended up rejecting my hypothesis and then I had to form a new hypothesis. Okay, but I'm going a little ahead of myself. So we'll come back. We'll get to that in just a little bit. So step number 4 is forming a hypothesis. So let's recap. What's the first step, guys? Observation. You know what observation means. You know what all it entails. What's the second step? Questioning. Okay. Observation leads to questioning. You ask yourself questions. You ask questions about what you've observed. What is the next step? Exploration. You begin looking for the answers. You read in journals. You go to the World Wide Web. You try to find the answers. What is the next one? You form a hypothesis. Forming a hypothesis means you begin to decide based on all the information that you have gathered, you begin to come up with a possible answer to your questions. Okay. And then after you form a hypothesis, what's the next thing that you do? Well, you test your hypothesis. So the question is, how do you test your hypothesis? Well, the way to test your hypothesis is by carrying out an experiment. Okay. So you carry out an experiment. Experiment is something that you control, something that you can do. Well, how do you do that? You have different variables and you look at these different variables and you try to manipulate those variables, which is what an experiment is. Most important thing for you to note in an experiment is that you have a control group and then you have an experimental group. Okay. So when you have one group, that group you experiment on, and that group you change the variables, you try to see what is going to happen in that group. Okay, and then you have the experimental group. So the control group, you don't change anything. You grow it in the natural environment. You do the research in the natural environment. In the other group, which is your experimental group, you change the variable around. Okay, And then after you have carried out your experiments, important thing is you can't have just one group in your experiment. So if I'm doing my research about cats and what they prefer, I can't just use Prissy. I'm going to have a lot of different cats. I'm going to give them, maybe have one group as my control group, in which I give them only one type of food for a while. And then I have the other group in which I give them 2 or 3 different types of food, and I see which one they go to. Something like that. But you have your control group and your experimental group. You have a lot of different organisms in your group so that you can generalize the results that you get. Okay, and after testing my hypothesis, well, I draw a conclusion. Usually there are 2 conclusions. My hypothesis is supported, I accept it. My hypothesis is rejected. Then I have to start looking for a new hypothesis. I have to form a new hypothesis. Then the last one is communication. Okay, so after I have drawn my conclusion, science doesn't exist in a vacuum. I have to somehow make other people aware of what I found out. So I go to I go to conferences, I publish papers, I write journals that are related to my field. I write articles and send them to journals that are related to my field. That's the whole idea of communication, because I want other people to have an idea of what I was talking about. Okay, so that's the first part of chapter 1. And so what I wanted you to do on page 2, I said right below how you would test the hypothesis that plants require sunlight to grow. I want you to take a few minutes and just write that down. I'm going to ask you to do it on Blackboard so that I can read, but I want you to form a hypothesis. My hypothesis is that plants require sunlight to grow. What kind of experiments would you do? Remember, what's important is you don't have just one plant. You have different plants. How would you test that hypothesis? Okay, so take a minute and do that. And then I did say I'm going to talk a little bit about research that I did, so I'm going to use a few minutes to talk about that. And then you will finish up chapter 1. The second part of chapter 1 deals with characteristics of living things. I want you to note those characteristics. They're all in your notes. Note those characteristics. Note the characteristics of living things, and note the limitations of science. And you are done with chapter 1. Okay? So my experiment. I am from Nigeria. I had observed that Nigerian cucumbers were different from American cucumbers. That was my observation. So what did I do? I came up with a question. My question was, would Nigerian cucumbers be the same as American cucumbers if they were grown in the same place? Exploration. I started looking at different environmental conditions for growing cucumbers. And I saw that the cucumbers that you grew in Africa were different from the cucumbers that you grew in America. Okay? Based on that, I came up with a hypothesis. My hypothesis was that cucumbers that grow in Nigeria have a different yield. They have different characteristics than cucumbers that grow in the temperate regions of America. So how do you think I tested my hypothesis? Well, I got cucumbers from America. I got cucumber seeds. I was back in Nigeria at the time, so I got cucumber seeds from Nigeria. That's what I actually did for my PhD. I got cucumber seeds from America, took them to my home country of Nigeria where I did my PhD. And my PhD was on characterization of cucumbers. I grew them. Okay, so this is what's happening. I'm making sure that all of them grow in the same environment. I take the American cucumbers from the natural environment. Go to the Nigerian cucumbers and grow all of them in the same place. The Nigerian cucumbers are my control group because nothing changes for them. The American cucumbers are my experimental group because I'm taking them out of their natural environment, growing them in a different environment. And so my hypothesis was that the American cucumber would now grow and look very much like the Nigerian cucumber because they're all growing in the same environment. You guys see that? And so I did my experiment. I grew it. And they were still American cucumbers. They were still different. The characteristics was different. The water content of the Nigerian cucumbers are higher than the water content of American cucumbers. And that's still what happened. So guess what I did to my hypothesis? I rejected my hypothesis. That's right. You reject a hypothesis when the conclusion, the results are different from what you think your hypothesis was. So I rejected my hypothesis. And I formed a new hypothesis. My new hypothesis was that the reason why the American cucumbers are different is because of the genes, the genotype. Okay? And so when you genetically, even though you're growing them in a different environment, the genes determine the characteristics. The gene determines the number of days to yielding. The genes determine the water content and all the other characteristics that I was looking at. Okay? So notice how I have used every step of the scientific method. And then I started going to conferences. I rejected my hypothesis, formed a new hypothesis, started going to conferences, and talked about the results of my research. What I want you to do for classwork is observe. I've given you an observation. There is a relationship between different types of exercises and weight loss. Use the steps of the scientific method to investigate this observation. So what I want you to do is write each step first. Observation. I've given you the observation. Continue from then. What questions? Remember, you have to ask a question that you can design an experiment for. So what question do you ask? Based on your question, what exploration do you do? Which journals are you going to look for answers? Okay. And then what would be the hypothesis? You're not going to actually carry out the experiment. You're just going to tell me, if I'm testing this hypothesis, this is what I would do. What I'm going to be looking for is your control group. I'm going to be looking for your experimental groups. I'm going to be looking at the variables that you're measuring to be able to draw your conclusion. Okay. So I hope that helps you a little bit. And so you do that. And then you come up with whatever you think the results would be. I will accept whatever you think it is. And then for communication, I want you to actually tell me where you would publish your findings. Okay? Or whether you would go to schools and talk about it, or whether, whatever. Just be as creative as you possibly can. And that will be your very first assignment. If you're looking at your notebooks, I've told you, I want you to fill in the blanks. But also, if you go to page 111, page 111 is going to have, is the appendix. And beginning from page 112, those are the questions at the end of your, the textbook. Okay. Sometimes I'm going to assign these review questions. I don't want you doing them until I assign them. Some of them I will come up with different questions to ask you. If you do these review questions, they will help you as you read the chapter. Okay. So I think that for chapter 1, some of you may not have the book. I probably will just ask you those questions, but it's important that you get the book. For chapter 2, and I'm going to do this really fast. This was supposed to be a quick introduction, but with chapter 2, what you're actually looking at is the parts. Okay, so chapter 1, which we have just finished. With chapter 2, we're looking at the chemistry of biology. So I want you to know the types of energy, but most importantly, on page 9, and I'll probably put this as your classwork, I want you to look at the Chopkin's Cafe Mighty Good. I want you to write down the elements that are of biological significance. I've given you the symbol. Write down the full name. And then when you write down the full name, I want you to know the differences between a proton, between a neutron, and between a mass number, atomic number, the subatomic particles, and how each of those subatomic particles do. Okay? And I will give you a classwork for that at the end of the chapter, and that will be your homework. So at the end of this week, you're going to have homework on discussion board. You're also going to have an assignment. Those assignments will be posted on Wednesday, and they will be due on Friday. These notes will be posted on Monday, so you can start reading them, filling in the blanks, and get ready for your assignments. Okay? Again, if you have any questions, you can send me an email, uafangide@faulkner.edu. That is on Blackboard under the instructor contact, or you can ask it under the Ask the Professor forum. I hope it'll be a good first week for you guys. I'm here to help. I know that science is hard. That's why I wanted to make this video so you can watch it over and over and over again. Let me know what you're struggling with. Okay? We look forward to talking with you guys. Bye-bye.